Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the fiercest and honestly, most deeply misunderstood debates in modern sociology, the rapidly changing landscape of the American family. It's a topic that touches literally all of us, yet the underlying reality is way more complex than the daily headlines might suggest. So let's unpack the sociology behind the very structures we all come from.
Let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question. It's one you've probably heard debated on the news, in political speeches, or maybe even at your own dinner table. Is the traditional family unit truly dying out, or is it just reorganizing? Now, if you listen to the more alarming commentary out there, you'd probably think the core institution of the family is just totally collapsing. But when we step back and actually look at it through a sociological lens, the picture gets incredibly nuanced and, frankly, a lot more fascinating.
To get to the bottom of this, we're going to weigh two very different competing academic theories. On one side, you have the camp arguing for systemic decline, basically the idea that the family is actively losing its institutional function and, as a result, is failing society. On the flip side, we have the evolution camp. They argue that families aren't breaking down at all. Instead, they're simply adapting to some massive socio-historical shifts, transforming so they can survive in a completely different economic and cultural landscape.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the structural-functionalist thesis. Second, the constructionist antithesis. Third, the deinstitutionalization of marriage. And finally, we'll ground all this theory in the everyday reality of the second shift. Let's jump right in.
We're going to start with sociologist David Popenoe and his highly influential 1993 article, American Family Decline. Popenoe makes a really forceful case here. He argues that since 1960, the decline of the family has been extraordinarily steep and totally unique in historical context. Unlike previous eras where family structures kind of shifted gradually over centuries, Popenoe is basically sounding the alarm. He says the modern family is rapidly losing the essential functions that society relies on to maintain social order and raise the next generation.
Now, to really grasp where Popenoe is coming from, you have to understand his theoretical framework. He's relying on a structural-functionalist perspective, using the 1950s as his baseline for what a quote-unquote proper family should look like. This perspective defines the family strictly as a cooperative unit. Think of a dual-headed household with kids, sharing economic resources, and dividing up the labor. From this view, the institution has a specific job to do. So if a living arrangement doesn't fit that exact mold, structural functionalists argue that it's clear evidence of dysfunction and societal breakdown.
So what's his proof? Well, Popenoe points to a few key indicators. He notes that families have noticeably grown smaller, they become a lot less stable due to rising divorce rates, and they've lost their traditional social power and authority. But here's the crucial part. He argues there's a profound weakening in what he calls child-centeredness. He suggests that adults today are just less willing to invest their time, money, and energy into family life. Instead, they're turning those investments inward, focusing on their own self-development and personal happiness.
Okay, but is that the whole story? Let's move to our antithesis. Sociologist Judith Stacey steps in here and fiercely challenges Popenoe, offering a totally different lens, the constructionist perspective. She argues that the structural functionalist view is just way too narrow and honestly deeply ahistorical. For Stacey, the family isn't some rigid positivist institution that's been set in stone since the dawn of time. Not at all. It's an ideological, symbolic construct. It's actively shaped by history, politics, and culture, which means its definition is always fluid and constantly changing.
In fact, Stacey bluntly rebuts Popenoe's entire premise with this pretty striking observation. She says, it is simply anthropologically incorrect to claim that the family was once the only social institution in existence. She points out that using the 1950s, that Ozzie and Harriet era of unusual post-war economic boom and super strict gender conformity, as the baseline for all of human history is fundamentally flawed. That 1950s nuclear family was a brief historical exception, not the eternal rule. So judging modern families against that one anomaly completely distorts our reality. So instead of a narrative of decline, Stacey argues we are simply living in the postmodern family condition. The big takeaway here is that families aren't failing society, they are desperately trying to adapt to it. They're adjusting to incredibly diverse domestic situations and massive post-industrial economic changes. For example, the loss of the single-earner family wage means a 1950s model is mathematically impossible for most people today. The definition of family has just naturally expanded to include blended families, single parents, and cohabitating couples purely to survive modern economic realities.
All right, so how do we synthesize these two totally clashing viewpoints? For that, we turn to the work of sociologist Andrew J. Cherlin. He introduces this fascinating concept called the deinstitutionalization of marriage. Cherlin helps us understand that the strong social norms that used to strictly dictate how people behaved inside a marriage have really weakened over time. Because society isn't handing couples a strict script anymore for how husbands and wives should act, people are basically forced to figure it out on the fly and structure their lives on their own terms.
Cherlin actually maps out this incredible historical shift to show how we got here. Pre-20th century, we had the institutional marriage. That was all about economic necessity, working the farm, and strict legal survival. Then, by the mid-20th century, we shifted to the companionate marriage. That's your 1950s ideal, distinct male breadwinner and female homemaker roles, but bonded by affection and friendship. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and we have firmly entered the era of the individualized marriage.
In this new individualized era, Cherlin highlights the rise of what sociologists call the pure relationship. This is an intimate partnership that you enter into purely for its own sake. It's much less about societal duty, economic survival, or even having kids. It's almost entirely about personal self-development and mutual satisfaction. Now, because it only lasts as long as both partners feel fulfilled, marriage today is inherently more fragile, right? It's more susceptible to divorce. But for many modern couples, it's also deeply, deeply fulfilling in a way marriages of the past rarely were.
Let's ground all this academic theory in some hard data. 1.786. That is the United States reproduction rate for 2024. That means the average couple is having fewer than 2 children, which actually puts us below the population replacement level. It's the perfect illustration of both Stacey's and Cherlin's points. Families are absolutely growing smaller. But it's not necessarily because of some selfish decline in values. It's driven by conscious choice, massive economic constraints, the crushing cost of childcare, and a cultural shift away from seeing marriage strictly as a child-rearing factory.
And you know what else? Your socioeconomic reality heavily dictates your family structure today. We're seeing a really stark divide. People with higher educational attainment tend to marry later, have fewer kids, and interestingly, they divorce less frequently. Basically, they have the resources to sustain that individualized marriage. On the flip side, those with lower educational attainment and fewer economic resources often have higher reproductive rates but a much lower marriage rate overall. So your class and your education are fundamentally reshaping who gets married, when they do it, and how long those marriages actually last.
Now, we absolutely cannot talk about the evolution of the family without talking about the massive, daily exhaustion of running one. Enter the concept of the second shift. This is a term popularized by sociologist Arlie Hochschild, and it refers to the very real phenomenon where women work a full day in the paid labor sector only to come home to a literal second shift of unpaid domestic labor, meal prep, and childcare. The structural shift of women entering the workforce definitely happened, but the internal division of household chores, that lagged way, way behind. If you have ever felt completely burnt out, trying to balance a demanding job with a never-ending pile of laundry, you are living what sociologists call the stalled revolution. Thanks to decades of inflation and soaring costs of living, having a dual-income household isn't a luxury anymore, it's practically a requirement for survival. Yet, while women surged into the workforce, cultural expectations back at home stayed largely frozen in 1955. Traditional gender roles just haven't caught up to our modern economic needs, and that creates an immense amount of friction inside the home.
So what we are currently witnessing is a collision of two massive socio-historical changes. On one hand, you have the introduction of no-fault divorce laws starting in 1969. This legally empowered people, especially women, to leave unhappy marriages without having to drag it through the courts and prove wrongdoing. But on the other hand, the harsh economic realities of today require 2 incomes just to stay afloat. Families aren't living in a vacuum. They are being forced to reorganize completely to navigate these intense cross-pressures of new legal freedoms colliding with tightening economic constraints.
To bring all of this into focus, historian Stephanie Kuntz's research reminds us of a really critical truth. There was never actually a historical golden age of the family to return to. History shows us that families have always been fragile, they've always had deep internal contradictions, and they've always been highly vulnerable to rapid economic changes. What we're seeing today isn't some weird anomaly. It's just the ongoing requirement for adaptation in an ever-changing world. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Is the American family truly failing under the weight of lost social cohesion, or is it successfully reorganizing so it can survive a harsh modern economy?
Whether you view these massive changes through Popenoe's lens of institutional decline or Stacey's lens of necessary evolution, one thing is absolutely certain. The family unit, whatever form it happens to take, remains right at the very center of the human experience. Keep observing, keep questioning, and thanks for joining me on this explainer.